Close your eyes tonight. Now imagine opening them again, and 300 years have passed. Not a metaphor, not a dream. 300 years. Gone, while you felt only the length of a single night's sleep. Your city is dust, and rebuilt on its own dust. Your family's graves are so old no one remembers whose they are. And the coin in your pocket
Is this? No.
is the
This can't be
strangest
real.
thing anyone
is.
in the marketplace has ever seen. This is not a myth invented to frighten children before bed. It is preserved exactly in the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, verses 9 through 26, as a sign Allah placed in history for anyone willing to look at it honestly. The Arabic calls them Ashab Al-Kahf, the people of the cave. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Welcome to the Sakinah Retreat, a new home for Islamic audio dramas brought fully to life with voice and sound, for reflections rooted in the Quran and for the stories that have carried faith across centuries when nothing else could. If tonight's episode is the first thing you've heard from this channel, know this: every story we tell here will be handled the same way this one is, with care for what is actually written and honesty about what is not. Subscribe if that is a channel worth having in your life, and let this reminder find someone else tonight who needs to hear it. Allah tells us plainly in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 13, that He relates their story to us in truth. Young men who believed in their Lord, and He increased them in guidance. That is where we begin. Not in the cave that would one day hold them for 309 years, but in a city under Roman rule, where believing in one God without partner or equal was not simply unfashionable.
It was a crime worth dying for.
The city rose in tiers of pale stone above the harbor, its streets thick with crushed olives and sea salt, its temple crowned with smoke that never quite stopped rising toward a god that could not smell it. Under a king who called himself the shadow of the gods on earth, faith and anything else was measured in whispers. In a narrow room behind a cloth merchant stall, 7 young men sat close around a single trembling lamp, its flame dipping every time footsteps crossed the alley outside.
Lower the wick, not out, just low. A room with no light draws more eyes than a room with a little.
Every week it grows harder to find a room the guards haven't already searched. Yesterday they opened old Ferris's grain stores looking for hidden scrolls.
And found nothing, because Ferris keeps no scrolls. We are careful, Temlika. Careful people are not caught by accident.
Careful, people are caught by informers. My own cousin asked why I no longer bring incense to the temple on feast days. I told him I'd been ill.
You should not have to lie to your own family, simply to keep breathing.
We are not the first asked to choose between a lie and a blade. Let us not waste the lamp oil on despair. Speak what is true, and let that be enough for tonight.
Kashfa Tayyush lowered his head and led them, in a voice barely above breath, through the words that had become their private testimony, that their Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, that they would call on no God besides Him, that to say otherwise, even to save their own necks, would be to speak a falsehood their hearts could never hold. It was the same conviction the Qur'an itself records of them, in verse 14, that they stood and said, "Our Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth. Never will we invoke besides Him any deity."
Our fathers built shrines to stone shaped by human hands and called the stone their protector. I will not kneel to something I could break with a single hammer.
Someone is at the end of the alley.
The room went still. Sandaled feet slowed beneath the single high window, and a shadow crossed the gap under the door without immediately moving on.
If they find us, let it be while we are saying what we believe, not while we are pretending we don't.
The footsteps resumed and faded toward the harbor road. Tamlika exhaled as though he'd held his breath since the lamp was lit, and in the dark, unseen, Sazanush reached over and gripped his shoulder once, then let go.
We cannot keep meeting in the same 3 rooms. Sooner or later, one of them will not be empty when the guards arrive.
Then we will trust that the Lord who hears us in a locked room hears us anywhere else. Walls were never what kept us safe. Above the rooftops, a temple bell rang 3 times, calling the faithful of the old gods to the evening rite. None of the 7 moved to answer it, though each of them, once, before he knew better, had.
I still remember lighting the incense as a boy, my mother's hand over mine, guiding the stick into the ash. I did not know then that I was promising myself to something that could not hear me. None of us knew. That is not a shame to carry, Sazanush. The shame would be knowing now and returning to it anyway, for an easier life.
The captain of the guard was at the harbor gate again today, asking the fishmongers who among them keeps the old feast days quietly now, without incense, without wine poured to the stone.
He is building a list. I am certain of it. A list of the ones who have simply stopped.
Then let him build it. A list is only dangerous to those who flinch when their name is called. We will not flinch. We will simply not be there to answer.
It was, in the end, only a beginning, the first of many nights that would test how much a small, unremarkable room could hold before it was no longer safe to hold anything at all. Allah does not leave His servants without a way through what they cannot yet see. That promise, though none of the 7 had heard it spoken in those exact words, was already, quietly, being kept. 3 days later, the king's edict was read aloud in the market square. Every household would present an offering at the temple before the new moon, and any name absent from the registry of worshippers would answer to the palace directly. Dakyanis did not ask for belief. He asked only for its appearance, which he judged a smaller thing to demand and a harder thing to refuse.
An appearance is still a lie told with the body instead of the mouth. Bowing before the stone, even with an empty heart, is still a bow.
Then we will not bow, empty heart or full one. Let them read it 100 times in the square. It changes nothing that is true.
The 7 had scattered to separate corners of the market that morning, as they had learned to do, so no one watching would think to draw a line between them. Kashfa Tahyush lingered near the fountain, listening.
They have set a date, the new moon. 12 days, perhaps, before every name in this city is checked against a temple ledger.
12 days to do what exactly? We cannot vanish from a registry we were never eager to be counted on. Someone will notice and ask why.
People go unregistered for many reasons. Illness, travel, a death in the family requiring mourning elsewhere. It is not so strange a thing, handled quietly.
And if it is handled quietly for 12 days, and then the registrar comes looking in person, as he did to the Corvinus household last spring?
No one answered that directly, because no answer avoided arriving, eventually, at the same narrow door. That quiet evasion could delay discovery, but nothing built only on delay could hold forever.
My uncle keeps goats on the hill road, past the old quarry. He has not seen the temple in a year, and no one troubles him, because no one troubles a man who lives an hour from anyone worth troubling.
Say more of this hill road, Debanush. 12 days is not long. It may be long enough to walk further than a registrar cares to follow.
And so, almost without anyone naming it plainly, the shape of a plan began to form. Not yet a decision, only a direction. The way a traveler notices which road climbs toward higher ground before he has reason yet to take it.
If we leave the city, we leave everything. Trade, family, the small comforts of a known street. I want that said aloud now, so none of us discovers it as a surprise later.
We were never promised those things would last forever, only that whatever we hold on to in their place will.
That evening, the guard's drum sounded twice through the harbor district, the signal for a household inspection, not a festival, and lamps along the street winked out one by one as families pretended already to be asleep.
My father asked tonight why I no longer wear the amulet he gave me at my coming of age. I told him it broke. He looked at me the way he looks at a debtor who has stopped meeting his eyes.
That is a harder thing than any drum in the streets, Hazanush. A stranger's suspicion can be outrun. A father's cannot.
And it will only grow. Every excuse buys us a week, perhaps 2, and costs us something we cannot buy back. I do not know how much longer I can keep inventing illnesses I do not have.
Then let us choose leaving for the only reason worth choosing anything, because it is what is asked of us, not because it is easy, and not because the lying has simply grown exhausting.
By the time the fountain's shadow had crossed the square, the 7 had drifted apart, each carrying the same unspoken weight home through different streets, until, that night, over a dying lamp, at last, they spoke it aloud.
The captain of the guard had a soldier's patience and a bureaucrat's memory, and had begun, over recent months, to notice a pattern too consistent to be accident. 7 young men, sons of respectable households, absent from the temple steps on feast mornings, each offering, when questioned separately, a different and plausible excuse.
Bring me the registrar's ledger from the spring feast and the one from midsummer, and set them beside each other. I want every name missing from both.
By lamplight in the guardhouse, 2 columns of names were laid side by side, and 7 names, Maxalmina, Tamlika, Marnush, Sazanush, Kashfatayush, Bayurush, Debernush, appeared unmistakably in both.
7 sons of 7 good families, missing from the same 2 feasts, each with a different excuse. That is not misfortune. That is a conspiracy that has simply not yet been caught speaking its own name.
Word reached Kashfatayush first, through his sister, who worked in a magistrate's clerk's household, and overheard, half by accident, the order to bring the 7 in before the week's end.
He has our names. Not suspicion, our names, written, compared, matched twice over. There is no excuse left uninvented that will satisfy a man who has already done the arithmetic.
Then the choice we discussed for some future week is a choice for tonight.
I had hoped for one more evening in my father's house, even a silent one, even one where I said nothing true at all, only sat near him.
A silent evening in a house the guard may already be watching is not a gift to your father. It is a danger you would carry to his door.
The hill road past the quarry, then. My uncle's goat track climbs into the high country before it meets any road a patrol would think to search.
And then we live as fugitives in the hills until we starve or freeze or are found regardless?
No one asked you to be unafraid, Tamlika, only willing. We go to the hills not to hide from what we believe, but to keep believing it somewhere we are still permitted to breathe. Allah has never asked more of anyone than that. Walk as though you have somewhere ordinary to be. Do not hurry. Hurry is the one thing a gate guard notices, even half asleep.
Marnouche went first, alone, a coil of rope over one shoulder, as though bound for the quarry on legitimate business, and the gate guard barely lifted his eyes from a dice game to wave him through. They left the city in pairs, an hour apart, by 3 different gates, each carrying only what could be explained away as an ordinary errand. Behind them, unnoticed, a lean, sand-colored dog fell into step at Debernouche's heel and did not turn back. Above the last gate, the moon had already climbed clear of the harbor, laying a pale road across the water none of the 7 had time to admire, though Sazanouche glanced once at the dark shape of his own street before Berenouche touched his arm, and the 2 walked on. By the time the guard reached the first household the following dawn, the beds inside were cold, the doors unbarred from within, and the only trace of 7 young men was the shape their absence left in 7 grieving families, a shape the captain would spend years failing to fill. Allah describes this very moment in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 16. When you have withdrawn from them and that which they worship other than Allah, retreat to the cave. Your Lord will spread over you His mercy and prepare for you ease in your affair. 7 frightened young men could not yet have known those words. They were, that night, only living them.
Look back once, if you must, Sazanouche, but only once. There is a difference between mourning what we leave and refusing to walk forward because of it.
I am not refusing. I am only asking my own heart to keep pace with my feet, and it is slower tonight than I would like.
Then let it be slow. A heart that grieves what it loved honestly is not a weak heart. It is simply an honest one, and Allah does not despise honesty, even when it walks a little behind the rest of us.
The cave opened in the flank of the hillside like a held breath, its mouth wide enough for 2 men abreast, its floor sloping into a cool dark that swallowed torchlight after a dozen paces. Debernouche's uncle had spoken of it only as a place goats sheltered from storms. He had not known, or had not said, how naturally it seemed to have been waiting.
Dry, sheltered from the wind. The entrance faces east, so morning light will reach the threshold before it reaches us. We can wake with light and still keep the depths in shadow.
It is also a single door with no second way out. If they find this hillside, we are not hidden here. We are trapped here.
Every hiding place in the world has that flaw, Tamlika, if you look at it long enough. We were never promised a perfectly safe room, only that Allah watches every room, safe or not.
The dog that had followed them from the city settled at the very lip of the cave, 4 paws extended before it on the stone, as though it alone had already decided this was a threshold worth guarding rather than a wall worth fearing.
Kitmir has more certainty in his 4 legs than I have managed in 2. He is not even looking back toward the city.
Perhaps that is worth learning from. He does not grieve what is behind him. He simply keeps watch on what is ahead.
We have walked a night and half a day on bread,
water, and whatever courage we could borrow from each other. Before we decide where each of us will sleep, let us give thanks to our Lord that we walked it at all and were not stopped.
They knelt together near the threshold as the light thinned toward evening, and Kashfatesh led them, as he had in the merchant's back room, through the words that had become their testimony, words the Qur'an itself preserves. Our Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth. We call upon no God beside him. 7 voices, low and uneven, some steady, some catching, none of them yet skilled at prayer spoken in the open air, rather than behind a locked door.
I will take first watch. There is a ledge just inside the mouth, wide enough to sit, and a clear line down the goat track for half a mile before it bends from sight.
Good. Wake Baranush at the moon's height, and let no one keep watch alone past exhaustion. Tired eyes see what they expect to see, not what is actually there.
Night settled over the hillside slowly, the sky thickening with stars long before true dark, and below, faint and distant, the city's lamps came alight one by one, indifferent to the 7 who no longer walked among them.
Do you think they have already noticed we are gone?
By now, certainly. Whether they will think to look this far and this soon is a different question, and not one worth spending the whole night awake over.
We have water for perhaps 4 days if we are careful, and bread for 2. After that, someone will need to go down to the lower villages, quietly, and only when we judge it safe.
And if it is never safe, if every village between here and the coast is warned to watch for 7 strangers matching our descriptions?
Then we will trust for our food the same way we are trusting for our lives, 1 day at a time, and no further than that, because no further than that has ever truly been given to any of us, in the city or out of it.
Debernush climbed to the ledge just inside the entrance and settled with his back against the cool stone, the goat track a pale thread below him in the last gray light, Kitmir curling at his feet without being called. Behind him, 6 exhausted young men arranged their cloaks against the stone floor, and, one by one, fell into the kind of sleep that comes only after a day spent walking away from everything a person has ever known. It was an ordinary sleep, on an ordinary night, though nothing about the mercy already gathering over that hillside would remain ordinary for very much longer.
Days folded into each other on the hillside. Not many, only a handful, though each stretched longer than any day in the city, measured out in watches and water rations and the slow, careful business of not being found. On the 4th night, Tamlika could not sleep. He sat near the cave's mouth, knees drawn to his chest, watching the goat track for movement that never came, until Maxalmina, rising for his own watch, found him there.
You should be resting. Baranush has the middle watch. You were meant to sleep until it turned to mine.
I keep counting. 7 of us. 1 water source we have not yet found. Bread for perhaps 1 more day. And a captain who does not strike me as a man who lets 7 names go quiet in his ledger without a fight.
And what does the counting tell you?
That we will most likely be found, or we will starve first. And either way, this cave will be the last room any of us ever sees. I have tried to make my peace with that. I have not managed it.
Maxalmina sat beside him on the cold stone, letting the silence hold a moment before he spoke.
I will not tell you your counting is wrong, Tamlika, because I do not know that it is. We may be found, we may starve. I cannot promise you the end of this.
Then what is there to hold on to? if not some promise that it ends well?
Only that we did not come to this cave because we judged it the safest room in the world. We came because it was the one room left where we would not have to lie to stay alive in it. Allah asked that much of us, and we gave it. Whatever He asks next is His to give, not ours to guess at.
I do not think my fear has left me. I think I have simply run out of strength to argue with it every hour of every day.
Then rest instead of arguing. Go and sleep now. I have this watch.
In the morning, Marnus returned from a cautious scouting trip, breathless not from danger, but from relief, having found a spring half an hour below the cave, hidden in a fold of rock where the goats evidently also drank.
Clean water, close enough to reach before dawn, and return before anyone on the road below would notice a figure moving on the hillside. It will not solve the question of bread, but it answers the more urgent one.
4 days ago, we did not know this hillside at all, and now it has given us shelter, a threshold to watch, and water we did not think to hope for.
How long do we imagine we can hold out here, honestly? Not the counting of bread and water, the deeper question. Do we mean to live in this cave for a season, or do we mean it to be permanent?
I do not think any of us chose an ending when we chose this cave. We chose only tonight, and then the next night, and we have kept choosing it, one at a time, since.
That is closer to the truth than any plan we might invent to comfort ourselves. We are not the ones who decide how this ends. We are only asked to remain faithful to what brought us here.
Allah says of those who believe and are guided that He increases them in guidance and prepares their hearts with steadfastness. I did not understand that verse fully until this hillside. It is not that fear leaves the steadfast. It is that Allah gives them enough to keep walking despite it.
Then perhaps that is what last night was. Not fear leaving, only enough given to keep walking through it.
Below them, unseen, the last lamps of the distant city went dark one by one, and Khidmir, who had not left the threshold in 4 days, lifted his head briefly toward some sound in the wind, then settled again, undisturbed, exactly as he had every evening since the city.
It was an ordinary evening by then, or as ordinary as any evening could be for 7 fugitives in a hillside cave, the light going gold and then gray across the goat track, the small rituals of a shared meal settling over them like something almost like peace.
Tonight, the bread will not stretch to 7 full portions. I have divided it as evenly as I can.
It is enough. We have managed on less than this, and we will manage again if we must.
They ate in near silence, the day's small labors settling into their limbs as a weariness none of them registered as more than ordinary tiredness.
Before we sleep, let us say once more what we have said every night since the city, so that whatever comes, it is the last thing spoken between us.
And so, as they had each night, the 7 spoke together the words the Qur'an preserves of them. Our Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth. We call upon no God beside Him. And asked, in whatever plain words each could find, for mercy and for a way through what lay ahead.
Whatever tomorrow holds, let us meet it as we met tonight, together and without shame for what we believe.
I noticed tonight I did not count once. Not the water, not the bread, not the odds of the captain's men finding this hillside. I simply ate and prayed and now I am tired in the ordinary way.
That may be the nearest thing to rest any of us has found since the city. Hold on to it.
It was here, in the last quiet hour of that ordinary evening, that Allah set in motion what no torch or watch or careful planning could have prepared them for. He tells us in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 11, that he cast a covering of sleep over their ears in the cave for a number of years. Not a sleep like the ones before it, a stillness laid over 7 young men who had chosen exile over a lie, sheltered now entirely by the same Lord they had refused to abandon. Debernoush took the first hours of watch, as always. Kitmir stretched at the threshold with his forepaws extended before him, exactly as he had every night since the city, and one by one the others settled into sleep on the cool stone, a sleep that did not lift with the turning of the watch, or with the dawn, or with any dawn its sleepers would recognize as belonging to the world they had left. Nothing marked the moment outwardly. Allah tells us that the sun, when it rose, inclined away from their cave to the right, and when it set, passed them by on the left, while they lay in the open space within it, kept from harm, he says, by a mercy from him, and guided rightly by him alone. Had anyone stood at that threshold and looked upon them, they would have turned and fled in awe, for Allah says plainly they would have been filled with terror at the sight.
And he tells us one detail more, a small and tender one folded into a story otherwise vast beyond measuring, that he turned them gently to their right side and to their left, so that the earth itself would not wear away at bodies held perfectly still. No hand accomplished this. No one among the 7 woke to feel it happen. It was simply done, night after uncounted night, by the same care that had drawn the covering over their ears in the first place. Dust began, so slowly it could not be measured in any single season, to settle across the folded cloaks and the stone floor, and the goat track below faded first to a fainter path, and then, in time, to no path at all, reclaimed by scrub and thorn as the years the sleepers could not count continued patiently to pass. Kitmir remained where he had lain down, forepaws extended at the threshold, undisturbed by any of it.
So the cave settled into silence, and the hillside settled into silence around the cave, and the world, indifferent and unknowing, went on turning below it, while Allah, who does not slumber and is never unaware, kept watch over 7 young men. The city they had fled had already, in its own small and hurried way, begun to forget.
Dakianus did not live to see the 7, found or lost or spoken of again. He died some years after their flight, of an illness no different from the one that ends any other king's reign, and the city mourned him with exactly the measure of grief his officials required of it, no more. His idols stood a while longer in the temple square, garlanded on feast days, ignored on ordinary ones, until a later ruler, for reasons of politics rather than piety, had them quietly removed to make room for a different set of gods, worshipped with the same borrowed enthusiasm the old ones had once received. The hill road that had once led to Debernoush's uncle's pasture fell out of use within 2 generations, the goats sold or scattered, the quarry beyond it exhausted, its stone already old and weathered before anyone thought to ask what had become of the 7 young men who vanished the same season it was last worked. For a time, the city kept a small, uncomfortable mystery. 7 sons of respectable families gone in a single night, a captain's ledger closed unsatisfied, a handful of grieving households who told and retold, and eventually stopped telling, a story that grew vaguer with each retelling, until it was no longer about 7 specific young men at all, only a rumor of some hillside where a few had disappeared rather than bow to a king's stone gods. The cave itself kept its own silence. Rain found the entrance and did not enter far.
Wind scoured the outer ledge, where Debernouche had once sat first watch, smoothing it further, though nothing within the chamber's cooler dark stirred to notice the passing of a single season, let alone the 20 and then the 50 that followed it. Empires do not wait for sleepers. Roads once run reliably to the coast were rerouted, then abandoned, then rediscovered by different travelers for different reasons.
Coins bearing Dakianis's profile, once common enough to pass without a second glance across any market stall, grew scarce, then strange, then, to those too young to have handled one, entirely unfamiliar. The kind of thing a grandfather might produce from an old chest as a curiosity, turned once in a calloused palm, and put away again.
A shepherd, once in the second generation after the Seven's disappearance, drove a stray flock as far as the old quarry, and glimpsed from a distance the dark mouth of a cave he had never troubled to explore, and thought no more of it than any man thinks of a shadow that asks nothing of him. Twice in that first century, storms of unusual violence swept the coast, flooding the lower city and scattering fishing boats along the harbor wall, and twice the cave's high, sheltered position kept it entirely undisturbed by weather that reshaped roads and toppled buildings within the city itself, as though the same quiet that had settled over its sleepers extended in some small way to the ground that held them. 2 rulers came and went between the felling of the old idols and whatever the city's people had settled on worshipping by the 3rd generation, and neither had cause to think of 7 names once written twice in a captain's ledger and never crossed out. This is the nature of the years that followed. Not a single dramatic turning, but the accumulation of countless ordinary ones, each so unremarkable in itself that no single generation could have said with certainty when the old world had finally, fully become a different one. Allah makes a promise plainly in this same surah, that to Him belongs whatever is in the heavens and the earth, and that He is fully aware of everything, however slowly or however long it unfolds. A century is, to those who live inside it, an eternity of small griefs and small joys, weddings and burials, harvests good and harvests lean. To the one who holds it, it is a single page in a book already written. And still, at the mouth of an unremarkable cave above a road no one traveled anymore, a dog lay with its 4 paws extended before it, and 7 young men breathed slowly in the cool dark behind it, exactly as they had on the last ordinary evening any of them could remember. By the time a full century had folded itself into the past, the language spoken in the city's markets had shifted enough that a merchant from the Seven's own boyhood would have caught only every 3rd or 4th word of an ordinary haggle over the price of dyed wool. New buildings rose on the foundations of old ones, their builders unaware and uninterested in what had stood there before them. A temple to newer gods was raised almost exactly where the old temple of Dakianis's era had once smoked with incense, and no one laying its foundation stones thought to ask what, if anything, had been asked of that same ground 100 years before. The cave, meanwhile, had by now been forgotten so completely that it no longer appeared even in the loose oral geography shepherds passed to their sons, not marked as dangerous, not marked as sacred, not marked at all, simply absent from the mental map of a hillside that had, in every practical sense, stopped mattering to anyone still living. A 2nd century began the way the first had ended, quietly, without ceremony. Empires rise and are renamed by those who inherit them. Roads are cut and abandoned and cut again along slightly different lines. Children are born who will never meet their grandfathers and grow old themselves and are in turn forgotten by grandchildren who never met them either.
It would be wrong to say time did not touch the 7 at all. Their bodies did not age as bodies age in the ordinary run of years, sheltered by the same mercy that had first drawn the covering over their ears. But the world beyond the cave's threshold aged for them relentlessly on their behalf, spending down 2 full centuries of change, while its sleepers spent nothing at all. Coinage was reminted twice in that span, each new issue a little further in weight and craft from the coins the 7 still carried in the folds of their cloaks, though none of the 7 would have known to look for the difference, asleep as they were to every change the years were making around them. In the schools and courtyards of that rebuilt city, an old argument had begun to surface in a new generation's mouths, whether the dead could truly be raised, bone and breath together, as the older scriptures promised, or whether such a promise was only ever a comforting story told to soften the fact of an ending. It was argued seriously by some and mockingly by others, and settled in the end by no one at all. None of the arguers knew that 7 answers to their question already lay sleeping less than an hour's walk from where they argued, waiting only for the right morning to arrive. Somewhere in that long 2nd century, a wandering trader paused briefly at the foot of the hillside to water a mule at a spring, the very spring Marnouche had once found in a fold of rock, and remarked to no one in particular on the strange quiet of the place, before continuing on toward the coast without further thought. He could not have known that the spring had once, briefly, given water to 7 young men who no longer needed it at all, nor that it would go on running long after his own name, too, had been forgotten by everyone who ever spoke it. And still Allah had not forgotten a single one of the 7, though the city that once hunted their names had by now forgotten them completely. For he says of himself in this very surah that he is the best of guardians and the most merciful of the merciful, and a guardian who does not tire needs no reminder to keep watch over what he has already promised to keep.
In the city below, on an ordinary market morning some 280 years after 7 young men had walked out through 3 separate gates in the dark, 2 stallholders fell into the kind of idle conversation that fills the gaps between customers.
My grandmother used to say there was a story about that hill, something about young men who vanished into a cave up there, generations back, rather than bow to some old king's idols. I never put much stock in it.
Every hillside near an old city has a story like that, if you ask enough grandmothers. It is a fine tale for children on a cold evening, and little more, I should think.
Neither thought further about it, and the morning's ordinary business resumed within moments, the conversation already fading from memory, even as the words left it. This was, by then, the entire remaining shape of what had once been an urgent citywide manhunt. 2 strangers trading half a rumor across a market stall and setting it down again, unexamined, exactly as countless other half-rumors were traded and set down every ordinary morning across the world. The 3rd century wore on much as the 2nd had, its changes arriving too gradually for any single observer to mark a clear boundary between what the city had been and what it was becoming. New coinage minted and old coinage withdrawn, new roads laid over the ghosts of older ones, a slow and largely peaceful shift in what the city's people understood themselves to believe, and why.
Governors were appointed and replaced. A plague passed through the lower harbor district and was survived. A bridge collapsed and was rebuilt wider than before. None of it reached the hillside at all.
Within the cave, nothing of this reached the 7. No rumor, however faint, no fig seller's idle dismissal, disturbed the stillness that held them, breath by slow breath, exactly as it had held them from the very first night. Even as in the schools and courtyards above them, the old argument about the raising of the dead was taken up again by yet another generation, still unaware of how near a settled answer already lay, sleeping quietly less than an hour's climb from where they debated it. No witness came, in all that long 3rd century, to the cave's threshold. The hillside kept its secret undisturbed, the goat track long since erased, the spring still running quietly in its fold of rock below. So the 3rd century closed as quietly as it had opened,
and a fourth began, unheralded, over a hillside that had, by every ordinary measure the city's people still possessed, entirely ceased to matter.
Somewhere in the city below, a mason repairing an old wall found, wedged between two stones, a coin bearing a king's profile no one could quite place, turned it over once, shrugged, and set it in his pocket as an idle curiosity, never once suspecting how close, in distance if not in years, he had just come to the story it belonged to. Allah tells us in this same surah that He alone has full knowledge of the unseen in the heavens and the earth, how clearly He sees, and how clearly He hears. The people of that city, for all their arguing, had no guardian besides Him, and shared in none of His judgment.
300 years, Allah tells us in Surah Al-Kahf, verse 25, and He adds 9 more, 309 in total, a duration too specific to be legend's usual comfortable approximation, and too vast for any single mind, waking or sleeping, to hold the whole of it at once. By the time that duration neared its close, the city above the harbor bore almost no resemblance to the one 7 frightened young men had slipped out of in the dark. Its walls had been rebuilt 3 times over. Its gods had changed twice. Its language had drifted far enough that an ordinary greeting from the 7's own boyhood would have sounded, to a child born in this new era, like the half-remembered fragment of some older foreign tongue. Whatever official memory the city had once kept of 7 missing sons had long since dissolved into the general, undifferentiated past that every city eventually accumulates and stops examining.
And yet the cave remained, unmoved by any of it, its 7 sleepers and the dog before them exactly where they had lain down, on what still felt, to each of them, though none yet knew it, like a single unbroken evening. It is a strange and specific mercy, this kind of sleep. Not merely rest extended past its ordinary measure, but rest so complete that no dream, no internal sense of duration accompanied it at all. Whatever the 7 would eventually feel upon waking would not be the heaviness of 3 centuries. It would be precisely the ordinary grogginess of a single night's sleep, run perhaps a little long. Narrator. This is the particular cruelty and the particular kindness folded together at the heart of the story, that the 7 who had given up everything for a single night's flight into a cave were about to discover that the world had not paused to wait for them, even slightly, while they, within their own experience, had barely closed their eyes. Allah is careful, throughout this surah, never to resolve the story beyond what He has actually revealed, not the 7's exact number, not the cave's exact location, only what matters, that He kept them, that the years passed regardless, and that a promise made in a locked room in a dying city was never once, across 3 centuries, forgotten by the one who heard it made. It is a caution the storytellers who first carried this account forward tried always to honor, resisting the temptation to invent certainty where none had been given. There is something worth sitting with in that restraint. A story told for its own sake tends to grow more specific with every telling, gathering invented detail the way a rolling stone gathers moss. A story told as a sign resists that pull, because the sign was never in the detail. It was in the fact itself that a sleep of that length happened at all, and that 7 ordinary young men lived to tell of it, however briefly, however few words they were given to tell it in. It is fitting, then, that the story itself refuses to rush toward certainty, even as it approaches its most astonishing turn. The morning that would end the sleep arrived like every other morning had arrived across those 3 centuries. The sun climbing over the ridge, light reaching first the threshold where Kitmir lay, then creeping, slow and gold, toward the depths where 6 other young men still lay undisturbed beside Moxilmina, who was the first, that particular morning, unlike every morning before it, to stir. Moxilmina opened his eyes to a ceiling of familiar stone, stiff-limbed and cold, and for a moment thought nothing more remarkable than that he had slept through the changing of every watch.
Debernush, you were meant to wake me.
no one answered. He sat up slowly, joints protesting, and saw the others beginning to stir. Temlika first, then Sazanush, each wearing the same bewildered look of men roused from an unusually deep and dreamless sleep.
I feel as though I have slept a full night and half a day besides. My legs are asleep from the knee down.
Debranush, who by his own memory had taken first watch and ought therefore to have woken hours before the others, rose last of all, rubbing at eyes that felt, to him, as though he had shut them only a moment ago.
I do not understand. I remember sitting at the threshold and Kitmir settling at my feet. I do not remember closing my eyes at all, and yet here I am, waking with the rest of you.
None of us kept a very disciplined watch, it seems. No harm done. Let us eat and be glad no patrol found us sleeping so carelessly.
Look at the entrance. The light falls differently than it did last evening, steeper, as though the season itself has turned in a single night.
Maxalmina rose and walked to the threshold, where Kitmir lay exactly as always, and looked out at a hillside that was, in almost every visible particular, the same hillside he remembered. And yet something in the light, in the scrub grown thick over what had once been a bare goat track, unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name.
The scrub was not here yesterday. I am certain of it. We walked this exact path 4 days ago, and it was clear enough to see the coast from the ridge.
Perhaps you misremember. One goat track looks much like another after 4 days in these hills.
I do not misremember. Something is not as it should be, and I would rather we discover what together than keep guessing at it one uneasy glance at a time.
Hunger sharpening into something more insistent than any of them could account for, after what each still believed had been a single night's sleep, decided the matter before further debate could.
We have almost nothing left to eat. Someone must go down to the city, quietly, buy bread, and bring back what news can be gathered without drawing attention.
I will go. I have spent 4 days being the most afraid among us. Let me at least be useful with that fear, rather than simply carry it.
Maxalina pressed into Tamlika's palm one of the old silver coins they had carried from the city, bearing the familiar profile of Dakianis, and told him, as he had a dozen times over 4 anxious days, to trust caution over speed, and to come back the moment food was secured. Temlika came down the hillside by a path his feet remembered even where his eyes did not, though the goat track he expected had thickened into something closer to a footpath through low brush, and the quarry he passed was, he was certain, deeper and more overgrown than it had been only days before. He told himself it was simply the strangeness of returning to a familiar place after fear had colored his last memory of it, and he pulled his hood lower as the city's outer walls came into view, walls that seemed from this distance taller and differently built than the ones he remembered climbing past as a boy.
They have rebuilt the gate in 4 days. That cannot be.
He entered by what he believed was the same harbor gate he had left through, though the guard posted there wore an unfamiliar uniform, and did not so much as glance twice at a young man in plain, dusty clothes passing quietly through on ordinary business. Inside, the market square where the 7 had once scattered to avoid being seen together was recognizably the same square in its bones, the same slope toward the fountain, and yet everything upon it felt subtly, persistently wrong. The goods on display, the cut of people's clothing, the temple visible above the rooftops bearing carvings Tamlika did not recognize at all.
That is not the temple of Dakianis' gods. I do not know these figures carved above the entrance. I do not know any of these figures.
He kept his head down and moved toward a baker's stall he remembered from boyhood, relieved to find bread still sold in roughly the shape and manner he expected, and held out the silver coin Maximina had pressed into his palm that morning. The baker took the coin, turned it once in his fingers with the idle motion of a man expecting nothing unusual, and then stopped entirely still, holding it closer to his face, turning it again, his expression shifting from mild curiosity into something closer to alarm. He was not a man equipped to judge whether it was genuine, ancient, or some clever forgery. Muttering that this was not a matter for a baker to settle, he pressed the coin back into Temlika's palm and pointed him, not unkindly, toward the far corner of the square, where a money changer kept a table each morning precisely for judging coins too strange for ordinary trade.
I only wished to buy bread quietly and return to my companions. Now half this stall is staring at me as though I had produced a stolen thing.
He gathered himself and crossed the square toward the money changer's table, telling himself that a coin was, after all, only a coin, and that whatever confusion it had caused could surely be resolved and forgotten within a few quiet words. Behind him, a small knot of onlookers began, in low murmurs, to trade guesses about the strange young man and his stranger coin, guesses that would, within the hour, travel considerably further across the square than Temlika himself had yet managed to walk.
Rufus had kept his table at the corner of the square for 11 years, long enough to have handled coin from a dozen distant cities, and long enough to trust his instinct for the moment a piece of silver was more interesting than merely valuable.
Let me see what has the baker so unsettled this morning. He is not usually a man given to raising his voice over a coin.
Temlika placed it on the table without a word, and Rufus lifted it, weighed it once in his palm, and turned it to catch the morning light across the worn profile stamped into its face.
This is Dakianas. I have seen coin like this exactly twice before in my life, both times in a collector's cabinet, treated as an object worth more for its age than its silver. Where did you get a coin like this, fit to spend at a bread stall?
It is an old coin, from my family. I only wish to buy bread for my companions, who are waiting and will worry if I am delayed.
Your companions may worry a while yet, because this coin was minted under a king who has not sat on any throne in this city for...
Rufus stopped himself, some private calculation crossing his face, and looked up at Temlika properly for the first time, not at the coin, but at the young man himself, his plain, unfashionable clothes, his manner of speech slightly formal in a way that did not match the market's easy modern cadence.
Forgive me for asking something that will sound foolish. What year do you believe this to be?
Temlika named the year as he understood it, the year of a king long dead by every measure the city now kept, and watched Rufus's face change from professional curiosity into something closer to genuine unease.
That year is not close to this one, young man. Not by a distance. I have the arithmetic standing here to properly measure.
You are frightening me, and I do not understand why. It was one night. We slept, at most, through a single long night in a cave above the hill road.
I believe that you believe that, which frightens me rather more than if I thought you were lying.
Rufus set the coin down carefully, no longer handling it as ordinary currency, but as something closer to evidence, and his voice dropped lower, gentler, the voice a man uses when he suspects he is about to deliver news that will not be easily received.
Tell me plainly, how many companions did you say wait for you on that hillside?
6. 6 companions, and a dog that has not left our side since we fled the city. Why does that matter to the price of a loaf of bread?
Rufus did not answer at once. He looked past Temlika toward the temple above the rooftops, its unfamiliar carvings catching the same morning light that had,
a lifetime and 3 centuries ago, once caught the smoke rising from Dakianus's own altars, and felt, for the first time in 11 years at that table, entirely unequal to the coin in front of him.
Word travels faster through a market square than any single voice could carry it, and by the time the city's newly appointed governor arrived at the money changer's table, summoned by a runner who could barely explain what he had seen, the crowd around Rufus and Temlika had grown thick enough to spill into the neighboring lanes.
Someone tell me plainly what has half this square staring. I was told a coin, and then a young man claiming to have slept 300 years, and I confess I do not know which claim I find harder to believe.
Both, my lord. This coin bears Dakianus's face in condition no collector's cabinet could explain, and this young man names a year for his own boyhood that predates your grandfather's grandfather.
Temlika, overwhelmed and increasingly afraid this was some misunderstanding he lacked the words to correct, could only repeat that he had left 6 companions and a dog on the hillside not an hour before, expecting to return with bread.
Please, send someone with me to the cave. My companions will confirm everything I cannot explain alone in this square.
The governor weighed the coin himself, studied Temlika's plain, outdated dress, and made the decision that would carry this story from a single strange encounter into public confirmation. He ordered a party, Temlika guiding it, to climb the hillside at once, and followed himself, unwilling to let so remarkable a claim be settled anywhere but in front of his own eyes. They found the cave exactly where Temlika led them, its mouth grown over with brush no goat track had cleared in generations, and within it, 6 young men who rose at the sound of approaching voices with the same bewildered, sleep-thick confusion Temlika himself had carried into the city that morning.
Temlika, you have brought half the city up this hillside for a loaf of bread. What has happened?
It was the governor himself, standing at the threshold beside a dog that regarded the newcomers with placid, unhurried indifference, who spoke the words that turned 6 more bewildered faces from confusion into the same slow, dawning astonishment Temlika had already lived through alone.
You are looking at a city 300 years older than the one you remember leaving. Your king is dust. Your gods, the ones you fled rather than worship, have been dust nearly as long. And you, all 7 of you, have been kept, somehow, exactly as you were the night you walked into this cave.
No one spoke for a long moment. Then Maxomina sank to his knees at the threshold, and the others, one by one, followed him down.
We asked our Lord only for a way through one dangerous night. He gave us 300 years as proof that nothing asked of us was ever, for a single moment, unwatched.
Among the crowd that had climbed the hillside, murmurs spread of an old dispute long argued in the city's schools and courtyards, whether the dead could truly be raised as the sacred texts promised. Standing before 7 living men who had, by any honest reckoning, already crossed that distance and returned, the argument dissolved, for those present, into something closer to certainty.
They did not live long after that morning, not because the mercy that had kept them through 3 centuries withdrew unkindly, but because, having served as the sign Allah sent them to be, they were permitted, gently, to return to the ordinary rest every soul before and after them has also been granted. Maxalmina was the first to go, within days, in a manner so quiet that those who had climbed the hillside to witness the wonder of them arrived a second time only to witness how simply that wonder concluded.
The others followed within a short span. Temlika, whose fear had carried so much of their story and whose courage had answered it. Marnoush, practical to the last. Sazanoush, who found peace with all that had been asked of him. Kashfatayush, who had led their prayers from the first night to the last morning. Beirunush, steady to the end. And Debernoush, who had kept the first watch, and seemed least surprised to learn how long it had actually lasted. Kitmir remained at the cave's threshold to the end and beyond it, not because scripture dwells long on the fate of a dog, but because those who first told this tale found something worth preserving in a creature that never once left its post.
The city wished to mark the cave in some lasting way, and there arose among its people, almost immediately, the very disagreement the Quran had already anticipated in verse 21. Some wishing to build a monument, others arguing it should remain unmarked, a private mercy rather than a public shrine. Scripture does not resolve which side prevailed, only that the argument was foretold, just as it was foretold that people would dispute long after over how many of them there had truly been. Allah tells us this himself in verse 22. Some would say 3, and a dog making 4, guessing at a hidden thing. Others 5, and a dog making 6. Others 7, and a dog making 8. He instructs that the matter be left exactly where he left it. My Lord knows best their number. None knows them except a few. This account has followed the tradition held by most who told it. 7 young men and the dog who would not leave them, while holding that number loosely, as Allah himself instructs, a matter of report rather than certainty. What can be said with confidence is only what the story was always most concerned to establish, that 7 ordinary young men chose exile over a lie, that their Lord sheltered them for years too vast to survive by ordinary means, and that they woke into a changed world just long enough to prove to a city that had stopped wondering that the raising of the dead was never merely a story told to soften an ending, but true. Narrator. It is said the Prophet, peace be upon him, encouraged reciting this very Surah Al-Kahf on the day of Jumu'ah, as light between one Friday and the next. If nothing else reaches you tonight, let it be this. Open Surah Al-Kahf this Friday and sit with these same 7 young men again, this time in Allah's own words.
That has been tonight's episode of the Sakinah Retreat. If this story kept you company tonight, subscribe and let it find someone else who needs 7 young men and a cave and 300 years to remind them that nothing given up for Allah is ever truly given up for nothing. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The families who had once grieved 7 vanished sons were by now names on cracked memorial stones in a burial ground itself grown crowded with later generations. The specific grief of that single night diluted over 200 years into nothing more than an old and half-remembered rumor of a hillside where some young men, long ago, had chosen to disappear rather than kneel to a king's stone.
In the schools and courtyards of that rebuilt city, an old argument had begun to surface in a new generation's mouths, whether the dead could truly be raised, bone and breath together, as the older scriptures promised, or whether such a promise was only ever a comforting story told to soften the fact of an ending. It was argued over cups of wine and bowls of lentils, seriously by some, mockingly by others, and settled, in the end, by no one at all. None of the arguers knew that 7 answers to their question already lay sleeping less than an hour's walk from where they argued. A single lamp, lit in some household in the rebuilt city on an ordinary evening, would have thrown more light in a moment than had touched the cave's inner chamber in the entirety of that 2nd century. A stillness so complete it had become, without anyone intending it, its own kind of shelter. And still Allah had not forgotten a single one of the 7. Though the city that once hunted their names had by now forgotten them completely. He says of himself in this very surah that he is the best of guardians and the most merciful of the merciful. And a guardian who does not tire needs no reminder to keep watch over what he has already promised to keep.